After bravely rescuing an elderly woman from muggers, a young boy is surprised to find a luxurious Mercedes at his doorstep. However, the criminals he thwarted rob the car. As they target him for revenge, he joins forces with the grateful woman and her resourceful family. Together, they delve into a dangerous game of cat and mouse, uncovering secrets that put them all at risk. Welcome to Podcast Stories. I'm your host, Mark Johnson. If you love your family and love to listen to interesting stories like this, subscribe to our channel. And now, put your headphones on and let's dive into this story.
The evening sun cast long shadows across the narrow alley as Ethan walked home from his late shift at the auto repair shop. The sound of struggling and muffled cries caught his attention. 20 feet ahead, 3 men surrounded an elderly woman, their intentions clear as they grabbed at her purse and jewelry. Ethan recognized the woman, Mrs. Johnson, from 2 blocks over. She lived alone in the old Victorian house at the end of Maple Street. The sight of her frightened face triggered something in him. Without hesitation, he charged forward, his footsteps echoing off the brick walls. "Hey!" His voice boomed through the alley. The largest mugger turned, revealing a switchblade that glinted in the fading light. Ethan's martial arts training kicked in. 3 years of intensive study that his mother had insisted on after they moved to this neighborhood. He assessed the situation quickly. 3 attackers, 1 armed, Mrs. Johnson backed against the wall, her glasses knocked askew. The first mugger lunged with the knife. Ethan sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and using his own momentum to slam him into the wall. The impact sent the knife clattering to the ground. The second attacker threw a wild punch, which Ethan blocked before delivering a swift kick to the man's knee. A sickening crack echoed through the alley, followed by a howl of pain. The third mugger, seeing his companions defeated, backed away before turning to run. Ethan let him go, focusing instead on the 2 disabled attackers. They scrambled to their feet, the one with the injured knee supporting himself against the wall. "This isn't over." The knife wielder spat before they both limped away into the gathering darkness. Ethan turned to Mrs. Johnson, who had slumped against the wall. Her silver hair was disheveled, and her hands shook as she tried to straighten her clothing. "Are you hurt?" he asked, helping her gather the contents of her spilled purse. "Just shaken," she replied, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't have taken this shortcut, but I'm always so afraid to be out after dark. I rush, you see, and then I make poor decisions." She clutched her recovered purse to her chest. "I live alone since Herbert passed. Sometimes I don't leave the house for days because of these thugs." Ethan walked her home, listening as she described how the neighborhood had changed over the 40 years she'd lived there. At her front door, she insisted on taking his number, promising to bake him a pie as thanks. Ethan declined politely, saying anyone would have done the same. The next morning, Ethan stepped out of his small rental house, headed to the corner store for his usual breakfast of coffee and a bagel. He stopped short at the sight that greeted him. A gleaming black Mercedes-Benz S-Class sat in front of his house, its polished surface reflecting the morning sun. The car looked completely out of place on his modest street, where most vehicles were at least a decade old. Ethan approached cautiously, circling the luxury vehicle. No signs of damage or forced entry, no notes left on the windshield. The windows were tinted dark enough to obscure the interior. The license plate was clean but unremarkable. Nothing indicated why this car, worth more than he made in 3 years, had appeared overnight in front of his home. He checked up and down the street, but the early morning revealed only Mrs. Peterson walking her poodle and the usual delivery trucks making their rounds. Nobody else seemed to notice or care about the mysterious Mercedes. Ethan pulled out his phone to take pictures, documenting the vehicle's presence. Something told him this was more than a simple parking mistake. The events of the previous night and this morning's surprise visitor had to be connected, but how? Ethan spent the morning circling the Mercedes, looking for any clue about its owner. As he examined the trunk, a black SUV crawled past his house for the 3rd time in 30 minutes. 2 men in dark suits sat in the front, their eyes fixed on the Mercedes. They didn't look like police or federal agents, Their posture was too tense, their observation too obvious. When the SUV passed again, Ethan pretended to check his phone while snapping photos of their license plate. Before he could get a clear shot, 3 men approached from different directions. Their casual clothes couldn't hide their threatening demeanor. The tallest one, sporting a fresh bruise on his jaw, looked familiar, one of the muggers from the previous night. "I'd step away from the car if I were you," the tall one called out. His hand rested inside his jacket, implying a concealed weapon. Ethan backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact. The men formed a loose circle round the Mercedes, making it clear they were claiming territory. "This, your car?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. "Just walk away, hero," another man replied, his voice carrying a hint of Eastern European accent. "Last night was a warning. This morning is a reminder. Some things are bigger than you." Ethan retreated into his house, watching through the window as the men spent 20 minutes examining the Mercedes. They seemed as puzzled by its presence as he was. Finally, they left on foot, splitting up at the corner. The black SUV made one more pass before disappearing. Deciding to investigate from a safer angle, Ethan walked to Mrs. Johnson's house. As he approached the Victorian structure, he heard frustrated muttering coming from an open garage door. Inside, a young man with thick-rimmed glasses hunched over a workbench, surrounded by computer parts. "Hello," Ethan called out. The young man jumped, nearly dropping the circuit board he was holding. "Jesus, you scared me." He pushed his glasses up his nose. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Mrs. Johnson. I'm Ethan, from last night." Recognition flickered across the young man's face. "Oh, you're the one who helped Grandma. I'm Jake, her grandson." He set down his work and extended a hand. "She's resting upstairs. Last night shook her up pretty bad." Ethan noticed multiple monitors on the workbench, displaying lines of code. "You're into computers?" "Engineering student," Jake replied, trying to fix Grandma's laptop. "She managed to download every virus known to mankind." He gestured at the equipment. "What brings you by?" Ethan described the Mercedes and the morning's confrontation. Jake's expression grew serious as he listened. Without a word, he turned to one of his monitors and began typing rapidly. "License plate number?" he asked. Ethan provided it from his photos. Jake's fingers flew across the keyboard, screens flickering with data. "This is interesting," he mumbled. "The car's registration is clean, too clean, like someone scrubbed the records." More typing, but cross-referencing with traffic cam footage. He pulled up a series of grainy images. This same Mercedes has been spotted at multiple crime scenes over the past month. Armed robberies. Mostly what kind of robberies? High-end stuff, art galleries, jewelry stores, private collections. Jake pointed to one image. "This one's from 3 days ago. Same car, parked outside the Natural History Museum during their annual fundraiser. That night, a rare diamond disappeared from the mineral collection." Ethan leaned closer to the screen. "Those men this morning, they weren't ordinary criminals. They were too organized, too professional. No kidding." Jake pulled up another window. "Look at this pattern. Every major heist in the city over the past 6 months, this car shows up somewhere nearby. But the weird thing is, it's never involved in the actual crimes. It's like it's overseeing everything," Ethan finished. "But why park it in front of my house?" Jake pushed back from the desk. "Either someone's sending you a message, or..." He trailed off, glancing toward the stairs leading to the main house. "Or what?" "Or they're sending a message to someone else," Jake said quietly. "Someone who might be watching you after last night." He started to say more, but stopped as footsteps creaked overhead. The pieces weren't fitting together yet, but Ethan felt the weight of something bigger than a simple mugging growing around them. The Mercedes wasn't just a car, it was a warning, or a signal, or both. And somehow, Mrs. Johnson was connected to it all. Mrs. Johnson's living room felt frozen in time, with its floral wallpaper and photographs spanning decades. She served tea in delicate cups while Jake and Ethan exchanged glances, neither wanting to start the difficult conversation. Finally, Mrs. Johnson set down her cup with trembling hands. "You'll hear about the Mercedes," she said. It wasn't a question. Herbert always said they'd come back eventually. "I just didn't think it would be like this." "Who's they, Mrs. Johnson?" Ethan asked gently. She walked to a bookshelf and removed a false panel behind some old encyclopedias. From inside, she withdrew a worn manila envelope. Herbert wasn't just an accountant, she began, spreading photographs across the coffee table. 20 years ago, he discovered something while auditing a shipping company. Discrepancies in the books, cargo manifests that didn't match, containers arriving empty. The photographs showed shipping containers, documents, and men in expensive suits shaking hands. Herbert documented everything. Mrs. Johnson continued. The company wasn't just shipping goods, they were smuggling art, antiquities, drugs, weapons. Millions of dollars worth of illegal cargo moving through our port every month. Jake picked up one of the photos. Grandpa was gathering evidence. He became an informant for the FBI. Mrs. Johnson nodded. His information helped bring down one of the largest smuggling operations on the East Coast. Several crime families lost everything. Politicians were arrested. But Herbert, her voice cracked. They found him in his car 3 days before he was supposed to testify. The police called it a heart attack, but he had never been sick a day in his life. Ethan studied a photograph showing a black Mercedes, similar to the one outside his house, parked at the docks. The car, it was their signature. Their messenger, Mrs. Johnson corrected. When it appeared, something big was about to happen. A major shipment, a hit, a betrayal. Herbert tracked that car for months. He said it belonged to someone they called the administrator, the person who coordinated everything between the crime families and their legitimate business partners. Jake's face paled. The car's showing up now, after the attack on you. They know who you are. They know about Herbert's evidence. But why now? Ethan asked. After 20 years, Mrs. Johnson's hands clenched in her lap. Because the statute of limitations on some of those crimes is about to expire. The ones who escaped prosecution could come out of hiding, reclaim their old territories. Unless there's more evidence, Jake finished. Evidence that could tie them to more recent crimes. The old woman nodded. Herbert didn't trust the FBI completely. He kept copies of everything. Documents, photographs, recordings. He hid them somewhere in the city. I never knew where, for my own protection. But he left clues, puzzles that only our family would understand. Ethan watched as shadows passed by the window. More men watching the house. Those muggers weren't random criminals. They were searching for something. They must have been watching me, Mrs. Johnson agreed, waiting for me to lead them to Herbert's evidence. When you interfered, they decided to send a message. The Mercedes. They're telling us they're back, and they want what Herbert hid. Jake began pacing. We need to find that evidence before they do. If it connects the old crimes to new ones, we could finish what Herbert started. Ethan completed. Mrs. Johnson grabbed both their hands. It's too dangerous. These people, they don't stop. They don't forget. Look what they did to Herbert. They're already watching us, Ethan pointed out. We're involved whether we want to be or not. At least this way we have a chance to end it. Jake pulled out his phone, scrolling through the traffic camera footage. The Mercedes has been connected to multiple recent crimes. If we can find Herbert's evidence and link it to these new cases, we'll need a plan, Ethan said. Somewhere safe to work from, ways to communicate without being tracked. Mrs. Johnson looked between them, fear and determination warring on her face. Finally, she stood and walked to a cabinet, returning with a small key. Herbert's study is in the attic. No one's been up there since it happened. If there are clues about where he hid the evidence, they'll be there. As they climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing a point of no return. The Mercedes wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. And somewhere in this city, hidden 20 years ago by a brave man who died for his principles, lay the evidence that could bring down an entire criminal empire. The abandoned warehouse loomed against the grey morning sky, its broken windows staring like empty eyes across the harbor. Jake had discovered its address encrypted in his grandfather's old files, a property once owned by the shipping company through a maze of shell corporations. "This is it," Jake whispered, checking his tablet. According to the city records, it's been abandoned since the smuggling ring was exposed. No one's touched it in 20 years. Ethan surveyed the rusted chain-link fence. Too obvious. If there was anything here, they would have found it. Not if they didn't know where to look. Jake pulled up a blueprint on his tablet. Grandpa left a series of numbers in his diary. "I thought they were dates, but they're coordinates. They match specific points in this building." They found a gap in the fence and slipped through. Inside, the warehouse was a cathedral of rust and shadows. Pigeons scattered at their entrance, their wings echoing off the high ceiling. Jake led them past rows of empty shelving, consulting his tablet. "The numbers point to the old office section," he explained. "But there's something weird about these blueprints. The dimensions don't match the building's exterior. There's extra space unaccounted for." They reached a corridor lined with abandoned offices. Decades-old papers littered the floor, stirring in the draft from broken windows. Jake counted doors, then stopped. "This wall," he said, running his hands over the peeling paint. "According to the blueprint, there should be another 10 feet behind it." Ethan examined the wall carefully. "Look at the baseboards. The paint's slightly different here." He pressed, and a section of wall clicked softly. A narrow door swung inward, revealing a hidden room. The space was small, barely larger than a closet. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall. A desk held an ancient computer, its beige plastic yellowed with age. Jake immediately went to work on the computer while Ethan checked the files. "Most of these cabinets are empty," Ethan reported, "but this one." He pulled out a folder. Inside were photographs, similar to the ones Mrs. Johnson had shown them, but newer. "These aren't from 20 years ago. Some of these are recent." Jake looked up from the computer. "Someone's been using this place. The computer's been accessed within the last month. There are files here about current shipments, payments, names." He trailed off as voices echoed from the warehouse floor. "Found anything interesting?" The voice was familiar. The Eastern European accent from outside Ethan's house. Footsteps approached the corridor. Jake quickly copied files to a USB drive, while Ethan gathered the most important-looking documents. The voices grew closer. "We know you're here. The administrator wants to thank you for making our job easier. We've been looking for this place for weeks." Ethan spotted a second door behind one of the cabinets, an emergency exit to the building's exterior. "Jake," he whispered urgently. Jake grabbed his laptop, leaving the USB drive still copying files in the ancient computer. They slipped through the door just as the men entered the hidden room. An angry shout followed them into the morning light. Gunshots cracked, bullets sparking off metal near their heads. They ran through a maze of shipping containers, the sound of pursuit close behind. Jake clutched his laptop to his chest, precious files bouncing inside. Ethan led them toward the fence, but a black SUV crashed through the gate ahead of them, cutting off their escape. "This way." Ethan pulled Jake between two containers. They emerged near a stack of empty pallets. More shots rang out. Jake stumbled, his laptop flying from his hands. It hit the concrete hard, the screen shattering. "Leave it." Ethan dragged Jake toward a different section of fence. They scrambled over, Jake's jacket tearing on the wire. Behind them, engines roared as the SUVs gave chase. They ran through side streets, using alleys and parked cars as cover. After 10 minutes of evasive maneuvers, the sounds of pursuit faded. They stopped in a crowded coffee shop, trying to catch their breath while looking normal. "The laptop," Jake gasped. "Everything we found." "Not everything." Ethan pulled the folder of photographs from inside his jacket. "We know the operation is still active. These photos prove it. And we know where their records are kept." "Were kept," Jake corrected. They'll clear out that room before we can get help. Maybe. Ethan spread the photos on their table. But they made a mistake. They showed themselves. Now we know they're still watching that warehouse. And look at this. He pointed to a photo showing men loading crates. In the background, partially visible, was the same Mercedes that had appeared outside his house. The administrator, Jake muttered, they're not just claiming old territory. They're actively running operations right now. And your grandfather knew. Ethan gathered the photos. That room wasn't just his evidence. It was his monitoring station. He was still watching them when they killed him. Jake's face hardened. Then we finish what he started. But we need help. These guys are killers. First, we need to get back to your grandmother. Make sure she's safe. Ethan checked the street through the coffee shop window. Then we figure out our next move. Because now they know we're looking. Mrs. Johnson's living room had become their war room, with the recovered photos and documents spread across her antique dining table. Ethan and Jake had used different routes to return, making sure they weren't followed. Now, they studied their findings, while Mrs. Johnson made endless pots of tea, her hands shaking less with each cup. These shipping manifests. Jake pointed to a document. They're using the same system Grandpa uncovered. But look at the dates. Some are from last week. Same false companies, same routes, even some of the same people. Ethan compared to photographs taken decades apart. They didn't just restart the operation. It never stopped. They just went deeper underground. Mrs. Johnson picked up one of the newer photos. This man here, in the suit. I recognize him. He was a junior partner at the shipping company when Herbert was investigating. Now he's running for city council. Politics, Jake muttered. Perfect cover for moving contraband. Control the port authorities. Influence shipping regulations. We need help, Ethan said firmly. Someone who knows how these operations work, but isn't part of the current system. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts. I know someone, Mark Ramirez. He was a detective when I was a kid. Worked organized crime. They forced him into early retirement when he got too close to something big. Jake looked skeptical. Can we trust him? They killed his partner during a corruption investigation. Made it look like a drug deal gone bad. Mark never bought it, but he couldn't prove anything. Ethan dialed the number. He runs a private security firm now, but he never stopped looking for the truth. Mark arrived an hour later. A stocky man in his 50s, with watchful eyes and a slight limp. He examined the evidence in silence, occasionally nodding or grunting. Finally, he sat back and fixed them with a hard stare. You kids stumbled into something ugly, he said. This goes deeper than smuggling. These operations, art theft, drugs, weapons, they're all smokescreens. The real business is influence. They're buying politicians, judges, cops, building a shadow government. The administrator, Mrs. Johnson, said quietly. Mark's head snapped up. Where did you hear that name? My husband's files. The black Mercedes. Christ. Mark rubbed his face. We chased rumors about the administrator for years. Someone working both sides, connecting the criminals with their legitimate partners, making deals, arranging accidents for people who wouldn't play along. He looked at Mrs. Johnson. Like your husband. How do we stop them? Jake asked. Mark pulled out his own phone, showing them photographs. Those muggers who attacked your grandmother. Low-level muscle, but they work for this man. He displayed a picture of a well-dressed man leaving a restaurant. Stefan Kovac. He handles personnel issues for the organization. My sources say he's been recruiting heavily lately. Something big is coming. Ethan described their visit to the warehouse. Mark's expression darkened. You found one of their active sites. That's why they sent the Mercedes. Not just as a warning, but to watch your reaction. See if you'd lead them to any other locations. Other locations. Jake leaned forward. Your grandfather wasn't just collecting evidence about past crimes, Mark explained. He was mapping their entire network. Safe houses, meeting spots, storage facilities. Information that would still be valuable today. They think you know where all of it is. Mrs. Johnson shook her head. Herbert never told me. No, but he left clues. Mark gestured at the photos. Look at the backgrounds, buildings, street signs. He was documenting their whole infrastructure. If we could find his complete records, we could expose everyone involved, Ethan finished. Past and present. Mark nodded grimly. But we need to move carefully. These people, they've had 20 years to embed themselves in every level of city government. One wrong move, and we all end up having accidents. Jake studied the warehouse photos. They'll be watching us even closer now. How do we investigate without tipping them off? We work parallel investigations, Mark decided. I'll use my security firm's resources to track Kovac and his men. You two focus on decoding your grandfather's clues. Find those other locations. He turned to Mrs. Johnson. Ma'am, we should move you somewhere safer. She straightened in her chair. This is my home. Herbert built our life here. I won't run. Then we set up surveillance, Ethan suggested. Mark's people watching the watchers. I'll call in some favors, Mark agreed. Get eyes on the Mercedes if it shows up again. But remember, trust no one outside this room. The administrator has people everywhere. As they finalized their plans, Ethan watched Mrs. Johnson staring at her husband's photographs. She'd spent 20 years living with secrets, watching her neighborhood change, knowing the people who killed Herbert were still out there. Now they had a chance to finish what he started, but the cost of failure would be even higher than before. The muggers made their first move 3 days later. Mark's surveillance team reported increased activity around the warehouse district. Men in suits meeting in parked cars, burner phones being distributed, weapons changing hands. Stefan Kovac was spotted meeting with city officials in private clubs and back rooms. Inside Mrs. Johnson's house, Jake worked frantically at his computer setup, now enhanced with equipment from Mark's security firm. They're mobilizing, he reported, tracking multiple surveillance feeds. Police patrols are being redirected away from specific areas. Traffic cameras in those sectors are conveniently malfunctioning. They're clearing the board, Mark observed, setting up zones where they can operate without interference. Ethan studied a map marked with the redirected patrol routes. These areas, they form a pattern. All major routes leading to the waterfront are being quietly abandoned by law enforcement. The first threat arrived by text, a photo of Ethan's house with a simple message, walk away. An hour later, Jake received an email containing footage of himself leaving his university lab. Mrs. Johnson found an envelope in her mailbox filled with photographs of Herbert's last days alive. They're escalating, Mark warned. This is their playbook. First threats, then demonstrations of power. Soon they'll start applying pressure. Accidents, break-ins, personal losses. Jake had anticipated this. Working through sleepless nights, he'd created a network of hidden cameras and sensors around their homes. His engineering skills proved invaluable as he crafted homemade security devices from everyday electronics. I've got motion sensors covering every approach, he explained, showing them his laptop screen, cellular jammers to detect their burner phones. Even built some basic facial recognition using security camera feeds. If anyone from our threat database comes within 2 blocks, we'll know. The Mercedes appeared and disappeared across the city, a black ghost marking the administrator's invisible movements. Mark's team tracked it when possible, but it seemed to vanish at will, emerging in impossible places with no clear route of arrival. It's not just one car, Jake realized. Analyzing traffic patterns, they have multiple, identical vehicles. When we track one, another appears elsewhere. It's psychological warfare, making the administrator seem omnipresent. Late one night, Ethan's phone lit up with alerts. Jake's sensors had detected movement behind Mrs. Johnson's house. Security cameras showed 3 men in dark clothing testing windows and doors. Before they could break in, Mark's team emerged from hidden positions. The would-be intruders fled, but dropped a phone in their escape. Jake cracked the phone's security, revealing messages about a planned operation at a downtown nightclub called the Mercury Room. It's a front, Mark confirmed. Management changed hands 6 months ago. New owners have interesting connections to our friends in the shipping business. The pressure kept mounting. Jake's university advisor suddenly questioned his research funding. Ethan's workplace received anonymous complaints about his performance. Mrs. Johnson's bank flagged suspicious activities in her accounts. They're trying to isolate us, Mark explained. Cut off our resources. Make us desperate. Standard tactics. Jake threw himself into his work, developing more sophisticated countermeasures. His latest creation was a mesh network of miniature tracking devices. We can plant these on their vehicles, monitor their movements without relying on compromised city systems. Good, Mark nodded. Because something's coming. My sources say Kovac has been meeting with private security contractors. They're bringing in professionals, people who handle problems permanently. Ethan found Jake in the garage late that night, soldering electronic components with shaking hands. We need to talk about contingencies, Ethan said quietly. If things go bad, I'm not stopping, Jake interrupted. They killed my grandfather. They're threatening my grandmother. This ends when we end it. Agreed, but we need a safe way to move Mrs. Johnson if necessary. Somewhere they can't reach. Jake set down his soldering iron. The Mercury Room. That's where it's all coming together. Whatever they're planning, it centers there. We need to get inside. It'll be heavily guarded, Ethan warned. That's why they won't expect us to try. Jake pulled up blueprints of the nightclub. I can create disruptions in their security systems. Get us past their outer defenses. We just need the right moment to strike. The right moment arrived sooner than expected. Mark's surveillance caught chatter about a major meeting scheduled at the Mercury Room, something involving city officials, shipping executives, and the administrator himself. One shot, Mark cautioned. We go in, we gather what evidence we can, we get out. No heroics. As they planned their infiltration, Mrs. Johnson watched from her window as the Mercedes glided past her house once again. This time, she didn't flinch. 20 years of fear were hardening into determination. Herbert's killers had finally shown themselves, and this time, they'd face more than just an accountant with a conscience. The Mercury Room pulsed with heavy bass and strobing lights, its Art Deco exterior masking a modern nightclub within. Jake, Ethan, and Mark approached separately, dressed to blend with the upscale crowd. Mrs. Johnson monitored from a secured location, coordinating through encrypted communications Jake had set up. Security count. Mark's voice crackled through their concealed earpieces. 8 visible at the entrance, Jake reported, pretending to check his phone. For more circulating through the crowd. Hidden weapons, professional stances. These aren't club bouncers. Ethan adjusted his fake designer watch. Actually a signal jammer Jake had built. Cameras on all approaches. They're running facial recognition. Not anymore. Jake smiled, tapping his phone. Their systems now looping empty footage from last night. We're ghosts for the next 30 minutes. They entered separately, using forged VIP passes Mark had procured. The club's main floor was packed with young professionals and wealthy party seekers. Perfect cover for their operation. But their target lay below. Basement access is behind the DJ booth, Mark murmured. Service corridor leads to private rooms. That's where the real business happens. Jake's surveillance had revealed a pattern of important visitors disappearing down that corridor throughout the week. None were ever seen leaving, suggesting a second exit. They worked their way closer to the DJ booth, maintaining casual separation. Ethan noticed Stefan Kovac at the bar, surrounded by suits. The Mercedes driver stood nearby, watching the crowd with cold eyes. Company's here, Ethan whispered. Looks like a full house tonight. Multiple targets confirmed. Mrs. Johnson's voice came through their earpieces. She was monitoring camera feeds Jake had hacked. City council members, port authority officials, even a judge. They're all heading downstairs. Jake reached the service corridor first, swiping a stolen key card. The heavy door clicked open. Inside, the music became muffled, replaced by the hum of ventilation. Plain concrete walls led to a stairwell. Security feed shows 2 guards at the bottom, Mrs. Johnson reported, armed. Mark produced a small aerosol can. Service inspection, he muttered. Maintenance called about a gas leak. Should clear the stairs. The gas, a harmless but potent irritant, did its job. They waited until the guards radioed for replacement before slipping past, using respirators hidden in their jacket collars. The basement level opened into a luxurious lounge. All leather chairs and mahogany panels. Multiple doors led to private rooms. Through one, they heard muffled voices growing heated. "That's the administrator," a voice growled. "Show proper respect." Jake quickly planted listening devices, while Ethan and Mark watched the corridor. The voices became clearer through their earpieces. "The operation is compromised," someone stated flatly. "Johnson's evidence is still out there. His grandson is getting too close." "The boy is smart," another voice replied. "Cultured, almost gentle, like his grandfather. But everyone has weaknesses. His grandmother, for instance." Jake's hands clenched, but he kept working. They needed proof, not revenge. Not yet. A phone rang inside the room. "Sir, we have a problem. Security systems are showing irregularities." The gentle voice hardened. "Check everything, now." "Time to go," Mark urged. They were halfway to the stairs when alarms blared. Emergency lights flooded the corridor red. Behind them, doors burst open as armed men poured out. "Split up," Mark shouted, drawing a pistol. "Rendezvous at point 2. Ethan and Jake ran while Mark provided cover fire. They reached the stairs, but found their exit blocked by descending guards. Jake pulled Ethan down a side passage. "Alternative route," Jake gasped. Grandfather's files showed old prohibition tunnels. Has to be how they're moving product. They found a heavy door marked maintenance. Inside, ancient brick tunnels stretched into darkness. Shouts echoed behind them as they ran, using phone lights to navigate. "Multiple hostiles in pursuit," Mrs. Johnson reported tensely. "Mark is clear, heading to backup position." The tunnel branched repeatedly. Jake led them based on his research, but the passages seemed endless. Their lights illuminated rat skeletons and crumbling walls. "Wait." Ethan grabbed Jake's arm. "Listen." Ahead, they heard engines. The tunnel widened into a loading area. Several vans were being packed with crates. Workers froze at their appearance. "Wrong turn," Ethan muttered, as guards raised weapons. A familiar black Mercedes sat nearby, its driver door opening. A tall figure emerged, face hidden in shadow. "Mr. Johnson," a gentle voice called. "Your grandfather made the same mistake, thinking he could expose us. Would you like to know his last words?" Jake's response was to throw something from his pocket, a homemade flashbang device. The explosion of light and sound gave them precious seconds to dive behind crates. Gunfire erupted, bullets splintering wood around them. Ethan spotted another tunnel entrance and dragged Jake toward it. Behind them, the administrator's voice remained calm. "You can't run forever. We own this city's shadows." They ran anyway, lungs burning, while Jake activated his phone's tracking beacon. If they survived, the signal would lead their allies right to the administrator's shipping operation. If they survived, safe houses were no longer safe. After escaping the tunnels through a storm drain, Ethan and Jake regrouped, with Mark at an abandoned factory he'd prepared as a fallback position. Mrs. Johnson was already there, brought by Mark's team when the operation went south. "They compromised our surveillance," Mark reported grimly. "Found most of our cameras, traced our data streams. Professional counter-intel team, we're running blind now." Jake salvaged what data he could from his devices. Got something though. Audio from their meeting, photos of the shipping operation, vehicle plates, even a partial voice recording of the administrator. "It's not enough," Ethan said. "Nothing concrete linking them to the current city officials. Nothing that would stand up in court." "Court?" Mrs. Johnson's bitter laugh stopped them. "You still think this is about legal justice? Look what they did to Mark's evidence. Look what they did to Herbert. She pulled a worn envelope from her bag. "There's something I need to tell you. About Herbert. About why they really killed him." The story spilled out in the harsh fluorescent light of the factory office. Herbert Johnson hadn't just been an accountant turned informant. He'd been part of their operation first, helping hide their money trails, creating the paperwork that made illegal shipments look legitimate. He was good at it, Mrs. Johnson admitted. Too good. They trusted him with everything. But then he saw what the money was funding: human trafficking, arms dealing, political assassinations. He couldn't live with it anymore. Jake stared at his grandmother. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I was ashamed." Because Herbert's evidence wasn't just about exposing them, it was his confession too. Proof of his own crimes. He knew they'd kill him for betraying them, but he thought his death might at least mean something. The revelation hit hard. Jake paced the room, processing that his hero grandfather had been part of the very operation he'd died fighting against. "This changes things," Mark said quietly. "Herbert's evidence would have more detail than we realized. Names, accounts, entire organizational structures. But he was one of them," Jake argued. "How can we trust anything he left behind?" "Because he tried to make it right," Ethan interjected. "He could have stayed quiet, stayed rich. Instead, he risked everything to stop them." Mrs. Johnson touched Jake's arm. "Your grandfather made terrible mistakes. But in the end, he chose to fight. That's his real legacy, Jake. Not the man he was, but the man he chose to become." The moment was interrupted by security alarms. Mark's phone lit up with alerts from his perimeter sensors. "Multiple vehicles approaching," he warned. "They found us." Through the factory windows, they saw headlights cutting through the darkness. Black SUVs and a familiar Mercedes. "Back exit," Mark ordered, grabbing go bags he'd prepared. Cars ready in the loading bay. As they hurried through the factory, Jake's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Your grandfather died begging for his family's lives. How much are they worth to you?" Ethan saw Jake's face harden. "They're trying to break you. Don't let them." "No," Jake replied. "They're scared. Everything we found at the club, the tunnels. It confirms Grandpa's old evidence is still relevant, still dangerous to them." They reached Mark's car just as gunfire shattered windows above them. The Mercedes glided into view, blocking their planned escape route. "Alternative route," Mark announced, spinning the wheel. They crashed through a rotting wooden door into an adjacent lot. More texts flooded Jake's phone. Photographs of his university lab, his grandmother's house, Ethan's workplace. All with the same message: everything burns. "They're not just threatening us now," Ethan realized. "They're going to destroy everything we might use to fight back. Every place we might hide. Every resource we might call on." Mrs. Johnson sat silently in the back seat, watching familiar streets blur past. She'd lived through this before. The running, the fear, the gradual closing of all escape routes. But this time felt different. This time, they had a chance to fight back. "Herbert's evidence," she said suddenly. "The main cache. I think I know where it is." Everyone turned to her as Mark drove. He used to say, "When everything falls apart, look where it all began." I never understood until now. "The shipping company," Jake breathed. "His old office. Ground zero for the whole operation." "It's still there," Mark confirmed. "Different company name, same building, but it'll be a fortress now." "Good," Ethan said firmly, "because that's exactly where they won't expect us to go." As they drove through the night, the weight of Herbert Johnson's past settled over them. He'd been a criminal who chose redemption, a corrupted man who found his conscience. Now his grandson had to decide, was exposing the truth worth the cost they would all pay? Ethan's decision to break away from the group came after another Mercedes sighting, this time outside the safe house where they'd relocated Mrs. Johnson. The message was clear. They could run, but they couldn't hide. "I'm a liability," he told Jake during a tense midnight meeting. "They're watching me too closely. I need to move separately, draw their attention, give you space to work." Jake wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. They'd discovered 3 tracking devices on their vehicles in the past 2 days. Mark's security team was being systematically dismantled, contracts cancelled, licenses revoked, equipment stolen in targeted break-ins. Here, Jake handed Ethan a small device. It looks like a regular phone battery, but it's a secure communicator, untraceable. I'll know if you need help. Ethan disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, making himself visible in strategic locations across the city. As expected, the surveillance teams divided their resources to track him, creating gaps in their coverage. Meanwhile, Jake found an unexpected ally in Mark. The ex-cop's experience with evidence handling proved invaluable as they planned their approach to the shipping company building. Your grandfather was methodical, Mark explained, studying Herbert's old office layouts. He would have hidden his evidence somewhere permanent, somewhere they couldn't renovate or destroy without raising suspicions. They assembled in Mark's remaining safe house, converting it into a planning center. Mrs. Johnson provided crucial details about Herbert's work habits, his private codes, his way of thinking. He loved architecture, she recalled, spreading out building plans. He studied the history of every building he worked in, said you could read a city's secrets in its foundations. Jake's eyes locked onto something in the plans. The elevator shafts. The original building had 4, but they sealed one during renovations in the 90s. It's still there, just hidden behind false walls. Perfect hiding spot, Mark nodded. They can't demolish it without compromising structural integrity, but accessing it. Service tunnels, Jake pointed. Maintenance access to the sealed shaft should still exist. Building code wouldn't let them block it completely. As they planned, Ethan's strategic appearances kept their enemies distracted. He led surveillance teams on carefully planned routes, always visible enough to demand attention, but never quite catchable. The strain began to show on everyone. Mrs. Johnson's hands shook more frequently, haunted by memories of Herbert's last days. Jake barely slept, splitting his time between planning the infiltration and monitoring his security network for threats. Then came the breach. Jake was working late when his monitors lit up with alerts. Someone had broken into his university lab, destroying years of research. Simultaneously, Mrs. Johnson's house erupted in flames. A faulty gas line, according to the fire department. They're burning our bridges, Mark growled, cutting off any chance of returning to our old lives. Classic isolation tactic. But Jake noticed something else. They're getting desperate. These attacks, they're crude, obvious. They're not even trying to hide their involvement anymore. Because time is running out, Mrs. Johnson realized. Whatever they're planning, it's coming soon. They need us neutralized before then. The pieces started connecting. The increased shipping activity at the docks, the meetings with city officials, the administrator's personal involvement. It's not just about Herbert's evidence anymore, Jake said. They're preparing something big, something that needs total control of the city's infrastructure. Mark's remaining contacts provided fragments of information, unusual cargo movements, private security contracts, specific dock areas being cleared for maintenance. We need to move, now, Mark insisted, before they locked down the entire waterfront. Jake activated his secure communicator. Ethan needs to know. Whatever they're bringing in, it's happening soon. But Ethan didn't respond. His tracking signal showed him stationary near the waterfront. To stationary, they've got him, Jake realized, horror dawning. They used our own plan against us. Let him think he was drawing them away, while they were actually hurting him. The communicator crackled. A familiar, gentle voice. The administrator. Your friend played his part well. Now, it's your turn, Mr. Johnson. Bring me your grandfather's evidence, or Mr. Chun's cooperation will become considerably more painful. They gathered around the building plans. Desperation fueling determination. The shipping company building loomed in their minds. A fortress hiding both Herbert's evidence and probably Ethan himself. We go tonight, Jake decided. No more planning, no more games. We get Ethan, we get the evidence, we finish this. Mrs. Johnson gripped his hand, Herbert believed one person could make a difference. That's why they killed him, because he was right. As they prepared for what might be their final move, Jake thought about his grandfather, a man who'd worked for monsters until his conscience woke up, a man who died trying to make amends. Now, 20 years later, they would enter the same building where Herbert had made his fatal choice. And like him, they were past the point of turning back. I'll continue. Here's topic 10, the final topic. Developed in 4,000 characters, maintaining the direct narrative style and bringing all threads to conclusion. The shipping company building stood illuminated against the night sky, its modern glass facade concealing the older structure within. Jake, Mark, and a small team of his most trusted operatives approached through maintenance tunnels, while Mrs. Johnson coordinated from a mobile command center, monitoring their synchronized watches. "Security is heavier than expected," Mark whispered, observing through specialized optics. "Armed teams on every floor. They're waiting for us." "Good," Jake replied, checking his grandfather's building plans one final time. "They'll be watching the obvious entry points. We're taking Herbert's route." They accessed the sealed elevator shaft through a forgotten utility corridor, climbing 20 years of dust and cobwebs. Jake's hand-built signal jammers kept them invisible to electronic surveillance, but they could hear activity through the walls. Boots on floors, radio chatter, the building awakening to their presence. "Ninth floor," Mark indicated. "That's where they're holding Ethan. Heavy guard presence." Jake nodded, thinking of his grandfather making this same climb, hiding evidence that would take 2 decades to resurface. The main evidence cache should be in the shaft's control room, behind the old mechanism. They emerged onto a maintenance gantry. Through gaps in the false walls, they could see figures moving in the corridor, guards performing their rounds. Jake activated his tablet, accessing the building's systems through vulnerabilities he'd discovered. The lights went out. In the chaos that followed, they moved swiftly. Mark's team created diversions on multiple floors, while Jake and Mark headed for Ethan's position. They found him in a corner office, guarded, but otherwise unharmed. "Took you long enough," Ethan managed a weak smile as they cut his restraints. "Had to make an entrance," Jake replied, but his relief was short-lived. "How predictable," a gentle voice came from the doorway. The administrator stepped into the emergency lighting's dim glow, flanked by Stefan Kovac and armed guards. The grandson, following his grandfather's footsteps, right down to the same fatal mistakes. Jake stood slowly. Not quite the same. The building's sprinkler system activated suddenly, but instead of water, Jake's modified compound filled the air, the same irritant they'd used at the nightclub, but more concentrated. The guard stumbled back, coughing. "Now," Mark shouted. His team burst in from multiple directions. In the confusion, Jake slipped away, heading for the elevator shaft. The administrator's voice followed him. "You can't expose what's already hidden in plain sight." Jake reached the control room, finding exactly what Herbert's notes had indicated. A hidden panel behind the ancient machinery. Inside was a laptop, files, and hard drives, all carefully preserved. But he also found something else, something recent. The administrator's words made sudden sense. The shipping company building wasn't just their headquarters. It was the center of their entire operation, the legitimate business hiding criminal enterprises across the city. Jake copied everything while battles raged throughout the building. When he emerged, he found Ethan and Mark had secured their floor. The administrator and Kovac had retreated, but they could hear police sirens approaching. "We need to move," Mark urged. "Whatever you found, everything," Jake said. "Not just Herbert's evidence. Their current operations, future plans, political connections. It's all here. They've been using the same systems, the same methods, for 20 years. Hidden in plain sight. Just like he said, they fought their way down through the building. The administrator's men were in retreat, but something felt wrong. They reached the lobby to find Mrs. Johnson waiting with a police tactical team. Real police, not corrupted ones. "Jake," she called out. "The port." They're moving something big tonight. That's why they needed us neutralized. The evidence confirmed it. Hidden in the files was their major operation, a massive shipment of weapons and contraband, scheduled to move through specific dock facilities, cleared of legitimate oversight. The administrator had spent months arranging it, bribing and threatening officials, clearing the way. This is what Herbert discovered, Jake realized. Not just their past crimes, but their entire methodology. The way they infiltrate, corrupt, control. It never changed. The police moved on the port facilities while Jake, Ethan, and Mark released their evidence to multiple agencies simultaneously. The administrator's carefully constructed network began to unravel as arrests were made across the city. They found the Mercedes abandoned near the docks, the administrator gone, a shadow retreating to whatever darkness spawned it. But his organization lay in ruins, its methods exposed, its political protection evaporating in the face of undeniable evidence. In the aftermath, standing in Herbert's old office as federal agents collected evidence, Jake found one last message from his grandfather, coordinates leading to a safety deposit box. Inside was a letter: to whoever finds this, the truth isn't in any single piece of evidence. It's in the pattern, the system they built. I became part of it before I understood what it truly was. My evidence isn't just about crimes. It's about how corruption spreads, how it infects everything it touches. But it can be fought. It must be fought, even if the cost is everything. Mrs. Johnson took Jake's hand as they watched the sunrise over the harbor. Cleanup crews were already at work, legitimate port authorities reclaiming their territory. Herbert would be proud, she said softly, not just of exposing them, but of understanding why it mattered. The city would take time to heal, to rebuild its institutions with proper oversight. The administrator's shadow might have receded, but Jake knew others would try to rebuild what they'd destroyed. But now they knew how to fight it. The evidence was preserved, the methods exposed, the patterns revealed. Herbert Johnson's last case was finally closed, and his grandson had helped write the final chapter. Ethan clapped Jake's shoulder. So, what's next? Jake watched port workers returning to their jobs. Police boats patrolling clean waters. Sunshine breaking through decades of shadows. We keep watching, he said. We keep fighting. It's what he would have done.